Good morning. It's so good to be back with you guys. I hope you all had a great Christmas and a good New Year's. I know I did. Got to go back home to Pennsylvania briefly, and so thank you for letting me do that. I really appreciate the break. I hope you all had a great time watching the Chiefs win yesterday. It was a big win. I think it's the first playoff win at Arrowhead ever. So next week, you got the AFC Championship, even bigger. And so hopefully they can pull it off. And so this morning, we're going to start a new series. And so I kind of told the people in Sunday school what we're doing. But if you remember last fall, the series that we did through Esther, through that Old Testament narrative, I remember talking to some of you guys about it, and you were saying how much you really enjoyed it, how much you liked it, and it was good. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, I really liked it too. I think that was some of the most fun I've ever had making a sermon series. And so I decided to go ahead and let's go back to the Old Testament for this new series and go through another Old Testament narrative similar to Esther. So we're going to be going through the book of Jonah over the next several weeks. And so I think what you'll find is that it's pretty similar to Esther. It'll be the same feel as that kind of series that we did. Just kind of that narrative and kind of unpack the story each week. I think it's just really fun. And so I think it'll be really good. But like most people raised in a church-going home, I've always been aware of the story of Jonah. That's one of the first stories that children are told in the Bible. And it's a classic story. And the story goes, this guy Jonah goes to the city of Nineveh. He gets called by God to go to Nineveh, but he doesn't want to do that, so he runs away. So he gets on a boat, but while on the sea, this huge storm brews, and the people on the board want to save themselves, so they throw him overboard. And so they throw him overboard, and he gets swallowed up by a big fish. And then while in the fish, he prays to God for forgiveness. And then the fish spits him out. And then he ends up going to Nineveh, and they all live happily ever after. Well, it turns out that's not exactly how the story goes. That's not exactly the accurate representation of all the details of all the story. The story of Jonah has much more detail, and it's a lot more complex than that. And actually, it can be quite difficult to pinpoint the exact application of what the story is talking about. Is Jonah about race and nationalism, since Jonah seems to be more concerned over his nation's military security than over spiritually lost people? Or is it about God's call to mission? Because God calls Jonah out to this city of lost people. Or is it about the struggles believers have to obey and trust God? Well, yes, to probably all of those. There's a mountain of scholarship on this book, on the book of Jonah, that really reveals how rich the story is, because there's so much application and so much we can pull from it. It has many layers of meaning and varied applicability, but that's what makes it so good. The narrative of Jonah seduces the reader into thinking it's just a nice little fairy tale, just a simple little story. But actually, careful readers find it to be an ingenious and artfully crafted piece of literature. It says Jonah is a prophet. He's one of the prophets in the Bible, just like Amos and Obadiah and Ezekiel and Habakkuk and all those guys. So he's got some pretty good company. But actually, I would argue that Jonah is one of the worst prophets in the Bible. Actually, I would go so far as to say Jonah is the worst prophet in the entire Bible. And we'll find out why as we go through the story. So if you haven't already, go ahead and turn your Bibles to Jonah so we can start to go through the story. But the book of Jonah has 4 chapters. And overall, the story can be split into 2 scenes almost. Chapters 1 and 2, and chapters 3 and 4 in scene 2. In chapters 1 and 2, Jonah is given a command by God, but he fails to obey it. That's the first half of the story. In the second half of the story, in 3 and 4, he gets the same command, but he actually goes through with it this time. So these are the 2 halves of the story that we'll see unfold. The book portrays these themes in almost exact parallel. The parallel patterns of the book of Jonah is absolutely incredible, really well crafted. But despite the book being a stellar piece of literature, a lot of modern people just kind of dismiss it altogether because of one thing. And I think you all know what that one thing is. We get distracted by this one thing. And that's the big fish. So we actually talked about this in Sunday school this morning. Charlotte brought it up just coincidentally. And so how you respond to Jonah being swallowed up by a great fish will, it depends on how you read the rest of the Bible. Did it actually happen, or is it metaphorical? Did it not happen? based on the structure of the story, I think it would be a stretch to say that it's a metaphor. But if you accept the existence of God and you accept that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead, which I would say is a far greater miracle, then I don't see anything wrong with interpreting Jonah literally, that Jonah actually was swallowed up by a fish. A lot of people today believe that miracles are impossible. Right? There's no way this could happen in real life. But that skepticism is also a belief that itself cannot be proven. Just as you can't prove that miracles do happen, you can't exactly prove that they don't happen. It takes faith to believe both, is what I'm trying to say. Fiction writers frequently add supernatural events to create excitement and grab the reader's attention. But the writer of Jonah doesn't exactly capitalize on this event of the swallowing of the big fish. The big fish is only mentioned in 2 brief verses out of the whole book. It's actually a very small part, but we make this huge deal out of it, and that's the central point of the story. So let's not get distracted by the big fish, because Jonah has so many rich things that has to tell us. Let's not get distracted by the big fish. The careful structure of the book reveals nuances of the author's message. Both episodes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, both episodes show Jonah, a staunch religious believer, regards and relates to people who are racially and religiously different from him. The basic problem in Jonah is that Jonah wants a God of his own making. He wants a simple God, one that he can control. That's his problem. So after that brief introduction, let's actually jump into the story here, looking at Jonah, verses 1 through 3. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port, and after paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. So that's all we're going to look at today, just those 3 small verses. But I think you'll be surprised at how much we can take just from those 3 tiny verses. There's a lot. So our story begins with the words, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah." And this is a usual way of how instances of prophets, biblical prophets' accounts start. The word of the Lord came to the prophet, just like they always do. God used prophets to convey his words and messages to Israel, especially in times of crisis. But already by the second verse, if you look at the second verse, the original readers would have realized that this prophet account was unlike any that they had ever heard before. God called Jonah to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it. This command was shocking on multiple levels. First, it was shocking because it was a call for a Hebrew prophet to leave his land in Israel to go to a foreign city. It had never been done before, ever. Jonah is the only prophet to be sent to a foreign country. His mission was unprecedented. Second, it was even more shocking that the God of Israel would want to warn Nineveh about its impending doom. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and we know a thing or two about the Assyrian Empire. Assyria was one of the cruelest and most violent empires at the time. Actually, the Assyrian Empire is one of the most cruelest empires of all of human history. They're awful people. Assyrian kings would gloat about their military victories by killing everyone in the city they conquered and then burning all of it to the ground. One emperor is well known for depicting torture, dismembering, and decapitation of his enemies. After capturing enemies, the Assyrians would cut off their captives' legs and one arm, only leaving one arm, so they could mockingly shake their hands while they sat there dying. That's what he did. They forced friends and family members to parade with decapitated heads of their loved ones on poles. They pulled out their prisoners' tongues and cut them off. They stretched out their bodies with rope to be flayed alive, and their skin was portrayed on the walls of the city. During the time of Jonah, the Assyrian Empire constantly threatened Israel. And then finally, it actually took over the northern kingdom of Israel. Yet it was this nation that was the object of God's mission. This is the nation he told Jonah to go to. God wanted to send Jonah to preach against Assyria. He wanted him to go so they could be safe from condemnation. How could a God of Israel want to send one of his own people into the enemy territory? That doesn't make sense. Why on earth would God want to help his enemies, the enemies of his people, the enemies of Israel? But that might not even be the most shocking part. Perhaps the most surprising element of this narrative is who it was that God chose to send. The text tells us that he sent Jonah, the son of Amittai. Now, there's no other background for this guy, Jonah, son of Amittai, which means that he's already been introduced earlier. He doesn't need an introduction. And actually, we're originally introduced to the character of Jonah in the book of 2 Kings. In 2 Kings 14:25, it tells us that Jonah ministered during the reign of Israel's king Jeroboam. So what does that mean? Who's Jeroboam? Jeroboam was not a good king. The other prophets who lived during his time, Amos and Hosea, criticized him harshly for his injustice and his unfaithfulness to God. But Jonah, on the other hand, supported Jeroboam. He didn't criticize him, he supported him. The original readers would have been amazed at Jonah. The original readers of Jonah would have remembered him as an intensely patriotic and highly partisan nationalist. And so it's pretty insane that God chose this man to go to another nation, one that he hates himself. Nothing about this mission made any sense. How could God have asked anyone to betray his country's interests like this? Let's look back at our text. God called Jonah to go to Nineveh. But it says in verse 3, but Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. The Israelites knew Tarshish as a place that was literally on the edge of the world. There was nothing past it. That was it. It was in the middle of nowhere on the edge of the world. Basically, Jonah did the exact opposite of what God told him to do. God told Jonah to go east, so he went west. God told Jonah to go by land, so he went by sea. God told Jonah to go to the big city, and so he got a one-way ticket to the edge of the world. He went the exact opposite direction in every way. So why did Jonah refuse? Why did he not want to do this? Well, the answer has to wait until later in the story when Jonah himself tells us why he wants to refuse. But for now, the text asks us to make some guesses as to why he refused. Based on what we know about Assyria, it's not too hard to guess why he doesn't want to go there. It's not a pleasant place. God describes Nineveh as the great big city, which it was. It was both a military and cultural powerhouse. Why would the people of Nineveh listen to someone like Jonah? I think it's pretty accurate to ask the question comparatively, how long would a Jew last in 1941 in Berlin, Germany, preaching against Nazi Germany? Not very long. Who would listen to Jonah? Nobody would listen to him. The prophet Nahum, actually several years before, had prophesied that God would destroy Nineveh for its evil, which makes perfect sense because everybody hated Nineveh. Nobody would have guessed that God would want to save Nineveh. That completely contradicts everything. That made no sense to the Hebrew people. What possible justification could there be for such a command? So Jonah had a problem with the command he was given. But he also had another much bigger problem with the one who gave him the command. Jonah concluded that because he could not see any good reason for God's command, there couldn't be any. There couldn't be any. Jonah doubted the goodness and the wisdom and the justice of God. He didn't trust him. He didn't trust that he was seeking what was best for him. We've all had that experience when we sit in the doctor's office just stunned the biopsy report. We doubt whether we're ever going to find a good job. We doubt whether we're going to make retirement work, how the future is going to look. We doubt why God had to take that family member away, why they had to die. We think if there is a God, he has no idea what he's doing. This can't possibly be for the better good. Even if we turn to the teachings of the Bible itself, it seems to most modern people that it's filled with claims that don't make any sense. Like being swallowed up by a big fish. Are you kidding me? When this happens, we must decide. Who knows more, God or me? Who's in control, God or me? Because the default mode of the unaided human heart is to always decide that we know what's best. That we do. the Renaissance period was the time period between 1300 and 1600. The Renaissance time period is known for all this progress in human history, just flourishing. Everyone loved the Renaissance period. But something really interesting happened in the Renaissance period that I think is really fascinating. Something changed in artwork in this period. The Renaissance is well known for its absolutely stunning art with different artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael. But something interesting happened with art that changed forever. God was always a central point in all artwork in pretty much all of history, including the Renaissance. God was a main point in a lot of paintings. But what happened in the Dark Ages was paintings portrayed God as huge and massive and mysterious. And they took up most of the painting. And man and humans were portrayed as really small and insignificant. They couldn't dare match up to the sheer power of God. But then in the Renaissance, something changed. You've all probably heard of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel in Rome, right? You've heard of his amazing Sistine Chapel. And at the centerpiece of that painting in the Sistine Chapel is a picture of God and David on the clouds surrounded by angels. And both of them are reaching out together. They're almost touching each other with their fingertips. You know that painting. It's absolutely stunning. Honestly, one of the most amazing paintings in all of history. We look at that now and we go, wow, that's amazing, that is beautiful. But I don't think we really fully grasp how revolutionary that painting was. Because for the first time in history, God was portrayed as the same size as man. God and man were the same size, both of them reaching out to touch each other. This was revolutionary because no one had ever thought about that. It was crazy. But the thing about this is the rise of individualism and autonomous reason at the same time as this painting changed everything. We no longer needed God. We don't need to trust God. We know what's best for us, not God. We became way too high. We compared ourselves to God and we said, I got this. I don't need him anymore. How individualism occurred, and if you look at society today and how individualist we are, it all stems from this painting. All of it stems from this one idea that we don't need God. It's crazy. If we can't see any good reasons for something God says or does, we assume there aren't any. We need to learn that we're not bigger than God. We're not even equal to God. He knows what's best for us, even if we can't see it. We have to trust that. Jonah runs away from God. But if we, for a moment, stand back and look at the entirety of the book, Jonah will teach us that there are two different strategies for escaping God. In chapters 1 and 2, remember in the first half, Jonah is given a command by God but fails to obey it. And then in the second half, in chapters 3 and 4, he's given the same command but then actually goes through with it. But in both accounts, what we'll find is that he's running from God. Even when he obeys him, he's still running from God. He's trying to seize control over him. If you remember, the first sermon that I preached here when I got back from my summer in Portland last fall was a sermon on Luke 15, the prodigal son story. And if you remember from that story, it's called the prodigal son story, but actually we learned that the story is just as much about the older brother than it is about the younger brother. And students, people that study the book of Jonah have found that there are insane parallels between Jonah and this story of the prodigal son. In the first half of our story in Jonah plays the younger brother. He runs away from God. He physically runs away from God. He wants freedom. He wants to do whatever he wants to do. He doesn't want to trust God. He plays the younger brother. But in the second half, Jonah plays the older brother. He obeys God and does everything he says. Yet at the same time, is running from him. He's just as equal, just as guilty as the younger brother. Because he doesn't love the father for the father. He loves the father for what he can get out of it. These are the two ways that we can run from God. The older son obeyed to get control over the father. Neither son trusted the father's love. Both were trying to find ways of escaping his control. Both of these are the two ways of escaping God. Assume the lie that we can't trust God's commitment to our good. That's what we assume. that we know what's best, not him. We think we have to force God to give us what we need. Even if we're outwardly obeying God, we're doing it not for his sake, but for ours. We only go to church, we only read our Bibles because we want to go to heaven. That's the only reason. Because I want to get something from it. So I think this is a good chance to check your motives on why you do the things you do. Why do you pray? Why do you read the Bible? Why do you come to church? Is it so what you can get out of it? Or do you genuinely do it for the love of the Father? I think it's important. When God shows his mercy to the Ninevites, Jonah explodes with anger. Similar to the older brother in Luke 15, Jonah becomes self-righteous with anger at God's graciousness and mercy towards sinners of Nineveh. And that's just the problem facing Jonah. The mystery of God's mercy. His mercy and grace is what makes God different from the rest of other world religions. Jonah runs, and even though he uses multiple strategies, the Lord is always one step ahead of him. And even though Jonah always runs, God never hesitates to offer him grace. Even though he doesn't understand it, even though he doesn't deserve it, God is still there, welcoming him back home. Even though we don't understand it, and even though we don't deserve it, he's always there to offer us grace. We disobey him. We say we know what's best. We go against him. We completely walk away from him. But yet he is standing there with his arms wide open, ready to welcome us back. The sheer grace that we don't understand and we don't deserve. But he gives it to us freely anyways. Jonah teaches us to look forward, to look ahead, to how God saved the world through the one who called himself the ultimate Jonah, Jesus. And how he sacrificed himself for us. And because he sacrificed himself for us, we can trust him. It's because of that sacrifice that we can know for certain that he actually has what's best for us in mind. We can trust him because he sacrificed himself for us. Even though we don't understand it, even though we don't deserve it, he sacrificed himself for us. And because of that, you can learn to trust him. You don't have to run anymore. You can embrace Jesus' love for me. Hug. Let's pray. God, I thank you that we don't have to run from you. I thank you that you're a God of love and patience and grace. I'm so glad that our performance doesn't matter. I pray that we would love you for you, not for what we can get out of it. I pray that we wouldn't control you. We wouldn't attempt to control you, to try to get what we want. Because ultimately you know what's best for us. Lord, I pray for humility. That we would understand that you're in control.